Whoever is listening, guys, welcome back. My name is Grayson Mann, and welcome to part 10, our final part of our Clemson football preview series, or episode 136 of the Man with a Plan podcast. Today, we have Alan Cole, a writer for Gamecock Scoop, which is the Rivals website that covers the South Carolina Gamecocks. I know Clemson fans, try to level with me here on this episode. We got some good content. Alan's a good guy, so I'm really excited about this one. Alan, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks. Appreciate you having me. It feels like we're almost back to football season now. We're recording this last week of July.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get started, I know we touched a little bit on SEC Media Day, but how was that for you? Just can you walk through any significant things that you heard or saw?
Yeah, so South Carolina went on the last day of media days. That's last Thursday. No crazy bombshells or anything. I did think it was a calmer media days for South Carolina. I don't know if you remember last year, the Shane Beamer Soldier Boy video, which kind of led to Mark Stoops making the comment about him, which started that whole thing. There were no bombshells. There was no, backhanded comments from him or from other coaches in the league. It was a calmer media days. I think that was probably by design.
And I think you had a tweet that blew up last year about the word count. Can you explain your process on that?
I really wish there was more to it. I was just sitting there last year listening to an interminable opening statement by Vanderbilt head coach Clark Leah, which ended up being over 2,000 words. And I was like, this is kind of long. So I just, once, they send the transcripts of these things, and I put it in a word counter. And then I was like, I wonder how long everybody else is. So I just started doing that. And I didn't expect it to blow up or anything. I just thought it was funny how long Vanderbilt's coach was talking. I definitely didn't think people would also think it was interesting, but that's been going for 2 years now.
You got a little bit of a streak going that the fans expect from you. So besides your epic word counts at SEC Media Day, can you walk through what your role is with South Carolina Rivals, how long you've been covering the team for, and just what your day-to-day role is when the season gets rolling?
Yeah, so I'm here a little bit over a year now. I started last July. I'm pretty much just the day-to-day beat reporter for the four major sports. So that's football, women's basketball, men's basketball, baseball. I know I saw you at baseball last year in the spring. But Clemson, I'm pretty much game coverage day to day, obviously press conferences, try to get some features out when I can, some like more in-depth stuff. I do some stat stuff in the fall. I try to like at least once a week have like a stats thing for football. But it's pretty much just being where the action is day to day, especially once football gets going here.
Yeah, and for South Carolina, I think we'll segue right into the 2022 season, which my top two words listed in my notes is roller coaster, because you have like two games where they take teams like Tennessee and Clemson, which we'll get into in a second, to the woodshed, putting up nearly 100 points in those two games. But then you also have situations against Florida and Missouri teams, only 16 points in those two games combined. So there's a lot of highs and there's a lot of lows for you. Covering South Carolina this year with Shane Beamer, Spencer Rattler was a big name in the transfer portal. What was that like to have really the up and down South Carolina Gamecocks 2022 year?
I think you hit it there when you mentioned Spencer Rattler. I felt like a lot of it kind of just depended on what version of Spencer showed up most weeks. That Tennessee game you mentioned, that was the best he was all year. He threw 6 touchdowns. And then that Florida game they scored 6 points against a 6-6 team. I do think a lot of it comes to Spencer for sure. And really just, this was something Shane talked about a lot at SEC Media Days. I feel like this is going to be a theme for him as we go through fall camp. It's about week to week consistency for this team. If you go look at his 2021, which was really just a Will Muschamp roster with Beamer's coaching staff. But his first year, they alternated wins and losses pretty much all the way down the stretch. They didn't have losing streaks or winning streaks, I think, after September, which of course they finished 6-6. They were a 500 team. And maybe that doesn't apply to 2023 as much. You're 2 years removed from that now. But I think week to week consistency is probably the biggest question mark for this program, and felt that way going week to week last year.
Yeah, I think that for South Carolina, and this is an interesting like tidbit from what you mentioned. It felt like some weeks that they're really on it. I think they're really interconnected. It felt like Shane Beamer was taking the right appropriate steps. And then some weeks you were scratching your head. I can recall the night against Tennessee where it felt like South Carolina almost did Clemson a favor inadvertently, as the chips fell in the right place for, as if Clemson had took care of business against the Gamecocks, they might have been in the playoffs had things really fallen their way, but it ended up not working out like that. And South Carolina gets their first win over Clemson. I believe it was 7 or 8 years.
2013, yeah.
Yeah. And so there's a lot riding into 2023. Spencer Rattler's coming back. I'd love to get your immediate reaction for that. And I think when you have a big name like that in any team, whether it be a quarterback, a receiver, a corner. Now, Rattler didn't necessarily have the year to justify potentially going to the NFL draft, but he was the guy that was considered a top pick heading into his year with Oklahoma before Caleb Williams took over. But what was that like for the Columbia community to have a guy like Rattler come back and have the offseason that South Carolina had? What has the offseason been like? And what is Shane Beamer's main focus? And we'll talk about the spring in a second, but what is this program's focus heading into 2023?
I think you mentioned the offseason. Everything kind of feels like it's on rocket fuel right now. I think the way last season ended, those last two throughout the bowl game. I mean, it was a bowl game. They had players out, opting out, but you beat Tennessee. You finally get that monkey off your back. You beat Clemson in the rivalry game. The last two games of the season, they certainly not maybe Georgia or Alabama standards, but they recruited well by South Carolina's track record. I believe that was their highest, at least by the Rivals rankings since the Spurrier era. Was their class last year. There's positive momentum here for sure. I think, to answer your original question, I think Spencer Rattler being back is a huge continuity thing. Having him for a second year, he's maybe not as much of a known commodity as you would like, going back to that inconsistency, but he is still a known commodity. He has played 13 games for your program now. I think that it's almost like a tease, right? Because if you're a South Carolina fan, you know what he's capable of now. You've watched it the last down the stretch. Again, especially the Tennessee game, does that version of Spencer Rattler show up more often than not this year? And I think that's what a lot of South Carolina fans are pinning their hopes on if there's going to be another jump this season.
Yeah, I think you go into the spring that there's a lot of questions about what this South Carolina team can do. And we'll talk about, I got a couple questions about where they stand within the SEC, the opener against North Carolina that just got announced as game day.
Game day, yep.
Which, depending on who you are, you're upset or happy about that. But for you in the spring, what was sort of the impression of this team? What's the energy like with the coaching staff, with the players? What was Beamer like? Because he's a guy that I think I personally like him. That might be sacrilegious to say as a Clemson reporter, but I gotta love what the guy brings to the table in terms of a personality. So what has he said that's really impressed you, and what can Carolina fans expect heading into fall camp?
I feel a lot of, and of course they're always going to project this, but I think there's a belief in what's going on here, and the fact that the win total jumped from 2 in Muschamps last year to 7 to 8, or 6 to 8 if you want to just count the regular season because they won a bowl game in year 1. But I think this is a very different looking, not very different, but it's a pretty different looking roster from what it was last year, which leads to some questions I have that we can definitely get into for sure.
Yeah.
But I think there's general optimism. There's general, I guess it hasn't not worked yet. You know what I mean? And I understand that there's some people have made the Will Muschamp comment, and he had an 8-4 regular season, his second season in South Carolina, and it didn't go from there. But right now, the returns are positive. You got a positive year 1, positive year 1 off season, a positive year 2, a mostly positive year 2 off season. I think there's an expectation and a belief that this team's going to take another jump, and I do think a lot of that is built on the way last season ended.
Yeah. This is a thing that we talked about in our interview with our UNC rivals writer that'll release. We're recording this on Tuesday. The UNC episode will have already released on Wednesday, but we talked about how each of these teams are following a similar path in year 2, where there was a lot of highs, there was a lot of lows. UNC thrashing in the ACC championship, not be able to beat teams like NC State with a third-string quarterback. South Carolina highs like beating Tennessee and Clemson, both come into this season. I think a lot of probably project them as more of the middle ground teams of their conferences, but they both have a lot to say. And I think that putting that in game day in Charlotte, there's a lot riding on it. How important to you do you think that matchup is to get things off on the right foot on a season where there's already a lot of momentum that's been transferred over from 2022? How maybe some look at it and say, hey, it's just a week 1 matchup, but how significant do you think that is for this team?
No, I'm actually, and I am, for people who don't know me, I am usually calm. I'm measured. It's a long season guy. I'm actually not going to do that here. I think that's a huge week one game. I think that's a momentum thing. I think that's trying to carry what you ended last season with. Obviously, it matters. Maybe not so much directly recruiting, but there are a lot of recruiting battles between South Carolina and North Carolina. Obviously, it's a chance to show off the brand. It's prime time, and here's the bigger thing, honestly, for me. South Carolina's schedule in September. You got UNC at the neutral site. You get Furman at home, and then you go at Georgia versus Mississippi State, at Tennessee in a revenge game. That takes you to the bye. If you lose to UNC week one, you're already staring at road games at Georgia and Tennessee in the first month. Like, it could go south pretty quick here if you don't get off on the right foot. So I actually do think that is maybe their biggest game of the year right out of the chute.
Yeah, and we had the same conversation with our UNC publisher for the rival site, Andrew Jones. He said that the same thing, that for this program for UNC, there's a lot riding on 2022 going into 23. They also have a little bit of a gauntlet to start out, saying, hey, if you could beat South Carolina or vice versa, there's a lot you could look forward to, instead of being like, man, we could be 1-5 heading into the bye. We could be 1-4 heading into the bye. With Georgia, I don't know what they're going to look like, but they're always going to be
They're
one of
still
the
better than you right now.
yeah. And then Tennessee, I like Joe Milton, but I'm more of a wait and see for that. And playing in Rocky Top's never easy, especially on
It's
a
a revenge
revenge
game
game.
too. I mean, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. So I think having those two road games in September, and Mississippi State comes to you too. That's sneaky. They won 9 games last year. People forget their quarterback's returning. Like, it is a tough September, and that obviously is not going to get any easier if you drop a week one game on a neutral site.
yeah. I think for the SEC too, there's a lot of question marks. At least for me going to this year, there's the obvious standouts. Alabama is going to be, I think they're going to be fine. Georgia in the East, we can expect them to kind of, to me, they are this generation or this decade's Alabama, where
Yeah.
you can expect them to at least be in the SEC championship or bust consistently. But for the rest of the SEC, do you have a kind of idea of where South Carolina fits into that formula? Or maybe where do you expect them to be finishing the end of the season?
Yeah, so I picked them. I believe I had them fourth in the SEC East because they still do division. This is the last year of divisions in the SEC. I know the ACC has already moved off that, but so I had them fourth in the East. I could see a scenario where they push second or third. Honestly, I think you've already said it. I think one's probably that's not realistic. Georgia's still Georgia, but I think it's very muddled in the middle. You've got a lot of transfer and or new quarterbacks in the SEC this year. You just mentioned Joe Milton at Tennessee. Devin Leary, Clemson fans are familiar with from NC State. He's at Kentucky now. You've got a new quarterback at Florida after Anthony Richardson goes to the NFL. Ole Miss got Jackson Dart in the portal. I think it's just a very muddy middle. It always kind of is in that sort of 6 to 8 win range in the SEC, I think. I think South Carolina definitely falls somewhere in there. Middle of the pack with a chance to push up just below the top tier would probably be your best case scenario, I think.
And I think you touched on something that really piques my interest in something I don't get to ask any of the other 9 riders we got in the series, because you're in the SEC. You mentioned 24, and I think it's just worth touching on because I have this opportunity to ask you, what was it like with the Oklahoma, Texas? You add them to the equation next year, and this could be, I guess, a 2-part question. Was there discussion of those just amongst this pool of riders and maybe coaches of what to expect from them next year? And South Carolina obviously will have the opportunity to play. I think they play Oklahoma in 2024.
Yep, they're going to Norman.
They're going to go to Norman. So what are your expectations for that? Are you excited? What is that? There's a lot of big picture questions about what this means for college football. We're really going to get to start to see things that we've known for years now actually materialize on the field. So when you add Oklahoma and Texas into the equation, how does that impact South Carolina in the big grand scheme of things in the SEC?
I think it makes it tougher. I mean, that's obvious. That's stating the obvious, but I think anytime you add 2 programs like that, it's going to be tougher. I think but it's also going to be tougher for OU and Texas too. Like, there's a separate OU conversation to be had that you could have honestly with your audience with Brent Venables. But yeah, I think there's an excitement though. I know South Carolina fans are excited. Like, oh, we get to go to Norman for a game. South Carolina's never played there before. Shane Beamer is obviously a former Oklahoma guy. Rattler won't be there next year, but there's excitement there. Um, I guess that's kind of what it is. I think everybody's a little bit excited, but also not sure how this is going to work. There's
Yeah.
kind of that same everywhere, unless you're Georgia or Alabama, where you know you're going to be fine no matter what. I think everyone's kind of looking around like it's going to get tougher, but it might be fun too. And eventually they'll go to Austin, and eventually Texas will come back to Willie B. Like, I think there's a general excitement.
Yeah, and there's a general in my mind. I just want to see how it works. Like you
Yeah.
touched on, we have no idea what's going to happen. And
Yes.
next year feels like not this season, but next fall feels like a guinea pig year for college football.
Mhm.
Once again, when you add the 12-team expansion playoff, we're going to have USC and UCLA joining the Big Ten. We're going to have Oklahoma and Texas joining the SEC. There's a lot of moving parts, and we get to kind of see all that work out. And I think when the SEC is at the forefront of almost every conversation of college football, that makes it very interesting too. So I'm excited to see how all the puzzle pieces come together, because college football has been a continually changing product since 2020. It feels like.
Yeah, I think I had this conversation with someone else, but 2014, which I know that was a little bit of a step back year for Clemson specifically, but that was a year where everything felt new. You had the playoff, things were, you were coming into this. We'd been in the BCS for so long, everything kind of felt fresh. It was fun that year. It ended up being, you had a 4 seed with a third string quarterback in Ohio State winning the national title. But I think you're going to get that next fall. It's just everything's going to feel new. It's going to feel different. And whether that's good or bad, we're going to have to just wait and see how we get down the road. But I think you're going to have a different feeling going into next year than you've had probably in about a decade.
Yeah, and I think that will speak volumes to the teams that are adding new players to the field in the conferences. So that's a conversation for another time, obviously, but I just wanted to make sure I wanted to get
Yeah.
your thoughts on that just because of the SEC bridge that. But we're going to enter our two central themes of this podcast series, and we talk about two things, and I think it's three for this episode, because when you talk about Clemson, there's a lot of layers to it,
Sure.
especially when talking between the state lines here. I love talking about program expectations in this series. You ask Wake Forest writers what their expectations are for their program, or NC State, or maybe I'm talking to my boss about Clemson expectations. Everyone's got a different answer almost. And so for a program like South Carolina, Shane Bieber still feels relatively new. At least to me, he does, because I'm so used to the Spurriers and the Muschamps.
Right.
So this is a program that's trying to find that consistent, I don't want to say dominance, but South Carolina was consistently at least one of the greater teams in college football with Spurrier around. What's the expectation for year 3 with Beamer heading into this season? And what's the expectation? How do we define expectations for South Carolina with all the things that we've talked about today, with new roster changes, Rattler coming back, and a pending change in college football next year? How powerful would it be for South Carolina to take that next step within that program before things ultimately change again and it feels like the bar gets reset?
Yeah, I think there's different reasons this can or can't happen, and I'm sure we're going to get into and why I have questions about it. But maybe this sounds like too much. I honestly think South Carolina fans are expecting 8-9 wins. I think that just goes back to what I was saying earlier about the upward trajectory, that you went from a 2-win team to a bowl team to an 8-win team that beat Clemson. I think in a lot of South Carolina fans' minds, especially with Rattler coming back, and you already have that quarterback piece in there, I think a lot of people feel like, all right, well, every other year is improved. This one's going to improve too. And if you just kind of parse that, all right, well, improvement from 8-4 means at least 9-3. And at that point, you're starting to run up into what your ceiling can be with Georgia, with Tennessee, with, they got A&M in a crossover game on the road. Like, I do, whether it's fair or not, I think the expectation is going to be 8-9 wins again, because Shane Beamer, the staff has set the expectation there by, I would say, probably overachieving last year. If I don't know, maybe that's a little bit harsh, but I don't think a lot of people had this team as an 8-win team last season, and that's where it ended up.
Yeah, and I think I had this conversation with a South Carolina fan before the game started. I was a guest on one of their podcasts, and they asked me what I was thinking. It was the weekend of the game, and they asked me what I thought, and I said, and this was before I had no expectation, but I said, what, I think South Carolina is close, but let's wait till next year. I think that's the year this rivalry becomes competitive again. My answer was just a year shorter than what I thought. South Carolina comes into Death Valley. Spencer Rattler plays really well, rebounds from an early pick 6 off of Jeremiah Trouter. And I think it was a really defining moment for South Carolina's program, especially under Shane Beamer, as well as Clemson, because changes were made in the offseason to almost prevent that from happening again because of how this rivalry has really progressed and where things are currently standing. So where do you see this rivalry, and just kind of get your big picture on it, especially now that it feels like the door is wide open because of Clemson finally giving up that win streak?
I do think door open is a good way to put it. I think whenever you have something like what happened last year, where you have South Carolina finally ending the streak and they do it at Clemson, I think anytime you have that in college football, the most important thing is capitalizing on it. And I do think South Carolina has done that to a decent degree in recruiting. Again, they're not recruiting like Alabama or Georgia. If you look at in-state recruiting, you've got a guy like Cam Pringle, like Blake Franks, like they are winning recruiting battles in the state of South Carolina over the last, I don't know how long it's been since that game, 8 months, 9 months, that they haven't been winning a lot. And definitely before Beamer, but even in the first calendar year of Beamer, that class of 2024 is built out of South Carolina kids. And I think that is not completely, but very much a pipeline from winning that football game and kind of what you can do with that on the recruiting trail. And that's ultimately what this all comes back to, is talent acquisition. So I think the rivalry is more competitive than it has been in a while. Clemson still have the upper hand big picture. Yes, they've won, what is it, 7 out of 8, whatever. It's still the program with the higher ceiling, I think. Well, I know they've won national titles. But I think it's more open than it has been for a while. And I do think I guess a better question for you, is there a sense of urgency on the Clemson side to not lose this game 2 years in a row, and kind of what that could mean recruiting trail, big picture? Like, I feel like there kind of is, right?
Yeah, so what I think this for me, and I said this in a Florida State crossover preview that we had with the rival site, is that this season feels not like a fork in the road for Dabo's job or anything like that, but it feels like a program defining
Yeah.
season where the last 2 years, and we'll talk about what your perspective on Clemson is in a bit, but for me, it's about this program lost 6 games in 2 seasons, and where from 2015 to 2020, where the playoff was not an expectation, but a formality almost. It felt like they were a shoe-in pretty easily. Clemson's got a couple of decisions to make. It felt like they fire Brian Streeter and bring in the hotshot Garrett Riley. The buzz about him is still evident. There's a picture on my Twitter of just this mosh pit that's around him. It is our opener media day last week. People are still excited about it. And I think that was one of those moves where, and I might be overloading this answer, but after the Orange Bowl in 2011, where Geno and Tavon Austin hang 70 on Clemson, Dabo fires Kevin Steele, brings in Brent Venables. They have a not similarly embarrassing loss, but they lose to Tennessee, a team that was down a bunch of players, down Hendon Hooker. You bring in Klubnik. They went to the end zone multiple times, couldn't finish drives. Dabo, 2 weeks later, after in the national championships, over 3 days after that, bring in Garrett Riley. So it feels like they're making those decisions, saying this is unacceptable. We have to raise the standard. So whether or not they lose to South Carolina or not, I think for them, we're going to see if these last 2 years were abnormal, or they're something to come. And so that actually, and I feel like a word vomit over there, but this is going to trail into what I want to hear from you about Clemson. And we talk about these central themes in this podcast series, is that I love hearing it's one thing for me to say, oh, this is a big year for Clemson, they have to make this happen or whatever. But I love hearing what the guys at Wake Forest are saying, or Miami rivals. What's their perspective on Clemson? So for you, where you're in the same state and the chief public enemy number one for your line of work is the Clemson Tigers, what have you been hearing from them, and what are your expectations for 2023?
So I think right off the bat, and this almost feels like a given, but I think Clemson's defense is going to be really, really good again. You mentioned Jeremiah Trotter earlier. He's back. Barrett Carter back. Like, that alone probably gives Clemson the best linebacker backing group in the country, probably. If not, they're definitely, like, maybe them and Georgia are right there, or maybe LSU with Harold Perkins. But they're in that elite cut at linebacker. Defensive line, really the whole defense, I think you feel pretty good about it for Clemson. That's really never been a question. Big picture, like Clemson perspective, you mentioned that run from 15 to 20, those 6 years. I guess my long-term Clemson question, and I think going to what you said, a lot of this can get answered in 2023, is what is the national title, national brand viability of Clemson without a one-of-one elite of the elite game changer at quarterback. Without Deshaun Watson, without Trevor Lawrence, what is Clemson's viability in that space? And to be clear, I still think the floor for Clemson is probably like 10-2 back in the ACC championship game. If you're a Clemson fan and you feel like you've declined in the last 2 or 3 years, I guess my question is more, can you get back there without having one of those guys at quarterback? And if not, then what is the new standard at Clemson? Is it just that next cut below, or maybe you're in the playoff every couple of years instead of every year? How does that look? And I guess to go back, can Cade Klubnik be? I don't think he's going to be Deshaun or Trevor, but if you get a really good version of Cade Klubnik and a really good offense with a clearly known commodity as a play caller in Garrett Riley, then yeah, Clemson absolutely can go back to the college football playoff. I think that's kind of been the question ever since Trevor left, is what's the quarterback look like and how much can this offense get back to what it used to be? And really that offensive line too. But that's kind of where I would say I put it. Big picture, I wonder about the viability and what Clemson can be without an elite quarterback. And in the immediate, I still think they're really freaking good and probably going to win 10 or 11 games again this year.
Yeah. I think I've heard the couple of comments from writers and just saying, hey, they were probably average quarterback play in games like Syracuse, South Carolina, Notre Dame, where if they had just come in with an average quarterback, maybe you think of like a Kelly Bryant, for example. Sure. If he was on this team, maybe it's an offensive scheme that held DJ Uiagalelei back. I think we're going to learn a lot from his tenure at Oregon State, which I'm really looking forward to seeing. We're just going to learn a lot. And I think whether it was scheme offensively or it was just quarterback play, I think that gets answered this year. And whether they're like what Michigan was before they made the playoffs the last 2 years, where they were this close every year, it felt like, that's where I could potentially see that being if they don't reach that playoff standard, that's just what Clemson is in the future. But like I said, we're going to find out.
You mentioned Kelly Bryant. I think that's actually interesting. So Kelly Bryant, his year is 2017, right?
He was the in between. A lot of people actually really forget that, I think. But
yeah. But even in 2017, at least if memory serves, Clemson wins the ACC. They get the 1 seed. They lose to Alabama in the playoff game. They kind of just get overwhelmed by them. But if Cade Klubnik is Kelly Bryant or close to Kelly Bryant with this defense, with Garrett Riley calling his plays, Clemson's probably back in the playoff, right?
Yeah, and I'm not saying Cade Klubnik. I'm not trying to compare him, but that's a name I heard thrown around.
That level of play, more not so much style wise, but that about level of play.
I meant that for 22. Like if you would substitute.
No, I know.
Kelly
I'm looking at 2023. Like if you get Garrett Riley's system with a Kelly Bryant level of play in that defense,
yeah, that's what I'd say. So yeah, and I think that's it's like I mentioned before, we're going to find those answers relatively soon because they face Florida State in September. They've got road tests against NC State. They play Notre Dame. They have UNC back. There's a lot of opportunities and examinations for this team. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that builds up into a rivalry game against South Carolina in Columbia, which I could expect to be one of the top matchups of the weekend.
That is just exciting to think about, honestly, a rivalry game it really be, because, I mean, you think about that. There's 2021 where there was some buzz with South Carolina. They were a bowl team, but I think it was pretty clear they were not as good as Clemson. Obviously, 2020, it's a COVID year. There is no rivalry game. It'll be we'll see how the year goes. It's always hard to project week 13, but it'll probably be about the biggest that game has felt in Columbia in a while. Mm-hmm. And I expect the atmosphere and the vibe that week to kind of reflect that.
Yeah, it'll be a blast. And with that, I think it's been a fantastic conversation now, and this will be episode 136 and our finale. So do you want to put any finishing touches on this series? You have the final word, it looks like.
No, I think I'm good. It just, if there's anything else about like South Carolina you were wondering about this year, I know you've asked a lot of like questions about Clemson and how I think, was there anything about this South Carolina team that you want to know or that you think maybe your audience should know?
I just say if you have any potential things to look out for in the fall before we wrap up, any key points or positional groups, love to hear it.
I think running back's probably the question right now. You lose Marshawn Lloyd in the portal to USC Southern Cal. They had Jaheim Bell, who was a tight end, who also played some running back last year. He portaled to Florida State. Right now, the running back situation is kind of Decarrion Joyner, who's bit of a gadget guy, kind of Swiss Army knife. He's played some wide receivers, some quarterbacks, some running back. You've got a D2 transfer in from Newberry College up the road, Mario Anderson. I think that's potential there, but that's a question mark. Then you've got Juju McDowell, who has played running back in the SEC, but has not had a big workload. And he's also just small. He's 5'8". So I wonder about the running back and kind of what that's going to look like. And that would be my biggest question from South Carolina is who emerges at running back. And the depth there is thin. It is a thin running back room. I think with a new offensive coordinator too at South Carolina, which we haven't mentioned, but they've got Dowell Loggins in. I think this is going to skew to a pretty pass-heavy offense.
Yeah, with Spencer Rattler under center, we can expect that, and hopefully it will. And if you guys have anything else about South Carolina, you can follow Alan Cole on Twitter. I'll make sure to link that down below in the description for this episode. And guys, this will put the finishing touches on what's been an unbelievable podcast series to do and produce, especially having the combined best of both worlds with the rival sites and this podcast. It's been unbelievable growth for this channel, which has been really exciting. So guys, thank you so much for the support on this series. Make sure to give Alan a follow and let you know that I sent you there. Guys, thank you so much for the support on this series. And we're going to be doing NFL coverage. Clemson football's fall camp's coming up, so I'll have some episodes on that. So guys, I can't wait to explore what this new year will be like. But subscribe as always. Take care and have a great day.